Today, we're going to be talking about ND filters, or neutral density. So you might be wondering to yourself, what is an ND filter? What ND filters do is they reduce the amount of light that's actually entering your lens or hitting your sensor, so then you have more control over what the image actually looks like. You could actually look at it as like sunglasses for your camera. Usually you screw the ND filter to the end of your lens, but sometimes lenses have a compartment to actually put an ND filter in, or when you get into like cinema cameras, that's usually when they're going to have ND filters built into the actual body. But you can actually go and get an adapter that goes in between the camera body and the lens, so then you don't have to worry about putting a filter on top of the lens or worry about your filter sizes or anything. It just makes it a whole lot easier, but those things can be more expensive than the actual ND filters themselves. So you might also be wondering though, does an ND filter affect the colors, the sharpness, or anything of your image? And the answer is no. ND filters typically don't have any effect on the sharpness of the image or even affect any of the colors. They're typically just used for exposure, and it's not going to affect anything else. Sometimes you're going to experience some vignetting going on, but that's only if you go with like cheaper filters. There's typically two different types of ND filters, the first one being a single stop, and then the second being a variable ND. A single stop is only going to be one stop. With single stops though, they're typically used on film sets. They're going to give you a little bit better of an image, but then using a variable is going to save you some money down the road really. They're going to be more expensive up front, but you're only going to have to buy one, maybe two if you want to actually get a little bit more stops, but variable NDs is the way that I think you should go. So talking about NDs for photography, you're typically going to be screwing these onto the end of your lens, but they do make matte box similar things of where you could actually put different squares or rectangles in front of the lens. That's going to eliminate that vignetting effect, but typically for photography you're going to be screwing it onto the end of your lens. But moving into the videography side of it, you can still screw it onto the end of your lens, but when you get into like high-end productions or on cinema cameras, you're going to be getting these things called matte boxes. What a matte box allows you to do is buy different types of filters, and you could even filter stack. So you could get like a mist filter and a variable ND, and you can stack those up, but that's a whole nother video that we'll talk about later. And again with video, if you do end up going with the matte box route, you're not going to experience any vignetting. It's going to give you a little bit cleaner of an image, but if you go with the matte box, getting those square and rectangle filters, it's going to give you a little bit more of a better image just due to no vignetting from having a circular ND on there. But continuing with the ones that you screw onto the end of your lens, those usually, the cheaper you go, the more the vignetting effect is going to be, and usually cheaper they are, the cheaper the glass. So if you're buying these expensive lenses, which we all know lenses can be super expensive, you don't want to be putting cheap glass in front of your really nice lens because it's just going to make everything crappy at that point. Your lens is already pretty sharp, the color reproduction is great, so going with a cheaper one, it's just going to reduce all of those effects. You're going to have a softer image, you're not going to have great colors in your image just due to this cheap glass that's in front of your great glass. Usually that is the case, but do your own research. Sometimes you could find these really nice cheap filters that are not going to have any of those effects I was talking about, but just do your research. The variable ND that I suggest to get is the one that I have. It's the Polarpro Peter Mckinnon edition. This one is great. It is on the pricey side of $250, but you get 2 to 5 stops with this, and the vignetting effect is slim to none. Another reason I suggest this one to get is because it comes with the hard case. You also get a nice lens cover though that's rubberized, that where you actually could just screw the filter on and you don't even ever have to touch the glass. Now moving into the single stop ND filters, those ones are usually not going to have as much of a vignetting just because they're not going to have that cross section of changing all the different stops, but those ones are going to give you a little bit sharper of an image. But just know though, if you want to get 2, 3, 4, and 5 stops, then it's going to cost a little bit more than actually going with a variable ND. You have to buy 3 or 4 different filters just to get the same variance of stops, so with getting a variable ND. If you're time sensitive, doing it that way it's gonna take a little bit more time because you have to actually unscrew the filters or change the filters out instead of actually just twisting it to change the stops. So now going into when you're actually going to be using these ND filters, you're not going to be using them all the time. I'm not using one right now. I'm in a studio, so you're not going to typically use them indoors. Typically you're going to be using it outside. Just remember though, you want to have that 180-degree rule, so whatever your frame rate is, you want to double your shutter speed. Now when you're outside, you're going to have to up your aperture though, because that's going to be too bright. If you're shooting in broad daylight, like high noon, you're going to have to raise that aperture. It's going to give you a less sharp image, and you're going to have everything in focus, which that's not what we want. If you're doing a client-based project, the client's not going to want to see everything in focus. You're going to have that nice blurry background just to help lead your audience's eyes to the subject that you're trying to focus in on. So right now you can see all of the background is actually in focus. Right now I'm at f10 just to keep everything perfectly exposed, but we put the ND filter on, you can see how much darker it gets, and well, then you can see I have this at 2.8 now. Background's blurred, so now it's gonna be putting more focus on me, and it doesn't make the image sharper, but just because it's at f2, the blurry background, now I'm the only thing that's actually in focus. It's gonna make me look sharper and stand out a little bit more. So when you're outside shooting 24 frames a second, you have your shutter at 1/48 of a second or 1/50 of a second. It's going to be way too bright even when you have your ISO all the way down. So you're going to want to slap an ND filter on there so then you could shoot at that nice 2.8, get that nice blurry background and keep your image nice and sharp. So going back into how it's going to give you more control, you're going to have more control with your camera, with your settings. You're going to be able to actually shoot at the 180-degree rule. It's going to allow you to lead your audience's eyes to the subject that you have in mind. It's going to give your clients or your audience a better sense of a higher production because it's going to look like you know what you're doing. These big budget films, they always have a nice blurry background because it's always trying to lead your eyes to where they have in mind and helps tell the story along the way. So that's all that I have for you today. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, please leave a like, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next.